This is a bit of a controversial statement, but BioShock 2 should be a better game than BioShock 1. It's got a more fluid combat system, it's got a greater variety of enemies, it gives you more options on how you want to play the game and solve problems throughout. It still has the fantastic source material of the original game from which to draw its environments and story. BioShock 2 should be a better game than BioShock 1, but it's just not. So to figure out where this game falls short, I first want to identify the things that I think BioShock 2 does really well, and in many cases does better than the original. The first and most obvious is the improved combat. The BioShock series uses a combat system that utilizes both traditional weapons and plasmids, which are basically genetic modifications that manifest as spells or powers that shoot out of your left hand. BioShock 2 makes a simple change to the core gameplay that allows you to use both weapons and plasmids at the same time. Many of you may not even remember this because you've blacked it out of your memory, but in the original BioShock, if you wanted to, say, freeze an enemy with your Winter Blast plasmid and then shatter them to pieces with your wrench, you had to first start in plasmid mode, press the fire button to use said plasmid and freeze the enemy, press another button to switch to weapon mode, and then press fire again to swing the wrench. It made for some cumbersome combat at times, especially during the often frantic battles that the game presented. BioShock 2 makes a huge quality of life change simply by allowing you to use both plasmids and weapons at any given time, making for much more fluid use between the two, and likely a better representation of how the developers actually wanted the combat to play out. It's something so simple it's almost kind of amazing that it wasn't in the original game. Speaking of the combat, the enemies in BioShock 2 are more varied, introducing foes like the Brute Splicer, the Big Sister, and even some different variations of Big Daddies. It really wasn't until I started playing this game that I looked back and realized how limited the enemy types in the original were, with basically a couple different types of Splicers and a Big Daddy thrown in here and there to fight. There's also more variety in one of the game's made upgrade systems, and that's the way you collect the resource Atom to purchase plasmids and gene tonics in order to enhance your character. In the original BioShock, once you defeated a Big Daddy, you could choose to either rescue or harvest its accompanying little sister. Harvesting gave you a bigger, immediate payoff, while rescuing resulted in fewer resources right away, but proved beneficial later in the game. And this was a really cool system. Even though it was just one simple choice, it gave the player the power to directly impact how they upgraded their character. But BioShock 2 adds another layer of choice on top of this. After defeating a Big Daddy in BioShock 2, this time you can adopt or harvest the little sister. If you choose to adopt her, she will then lead you to certain corpses of splicers that she can collect additional Atom from. But in making the choice, you have to fight off a horde of enemies each time she collects. This sequence is entirely optional, but gives the player an opportunity to collect even more resources should they choose to do so. The other cool part is that you can choose to adopt the little sister, help her collect the Atom from the corpses, and then still choose to harvest her afterwards for even more Atom. Or of course you can choose to rescue her, resulting in a few different branching paths that are options each time you interact with the little sister. It's a really smart way to expand on what was kind of a trademark element of the original game. All of these improvements should have resulted in an overall better experience, but I don't think I'm alone in saying that when I played through BioShock 2, it just really didn't feel the same. It didn't give me the same sense of awe that the original did, and I think there's a few reasons for this. The original BioShock was a landmark experience in gaming when it was released in 2007. It was nearly universally praised and is still used as one of the first examples people bring up when discussing things like world building, immersive storytelling, and using environments to flesh out the narrative of a game. The developers really brought you into their world of Rapture, and you felt like you were living through it as you were playing the game. As I mentioned earlier, BioShock 2 had the luxury of still being able to pull from this material, but it ended up falling a little flat in the areas that mattered. It unfortunately turned into one of those sequels that was in a way more of the same, except the parts that were the same weren't quite as good. Let's start with the narrative itself as an example of this. Both games revolve around the same dystopian society that ended up crumbling under its own pressure. In the original BioShock, there's a brilliant back and forth between your protagonist and the other characters who guide you along throughout the story. These characters are mysterious, interesting, and powerful, and the world of Rapture helps to tell their stories as you progress through it. It explores themes of utopia, objectivism, and free will, some pretty complex stuff that honestly the entire BioShock series is known for dissecting. BioShock 2, on the other hand, seems to be a little less focused as far as the story that it wants to tell. The game's narrative centers around your character's relationship with a little sister named Eleanor, as well as Rapture's new authority figure, Sophia Lamb. Additionally, you're guided through the game by Augustus Sinclair, whose role is similar to that of Atlas in the original game. Initially, the game's main theme appears to revolve around religion, as Lamb is billed as a savior of the people that is worshipped with shrines scattered throughout the world. But the game pivots from this and instead ends up telling a more personal story rather than one of larger, overarching themes like the first BioShock. Now, I don't have an issue with this smaller scale approach to a story as a whole. The real problem is that when you tell a story that's focused on the characters, those characters need to be interesting, complex, and engaging, and that just isn't the case in BioShock 2. One of the things that made BioShock 1 so appealing is that most of its characters had several layers to them. Bad guys were likable, good guys were questionable, and everyone was wrapped together into a narrative that made you question your very existence. BioShock 2 doesn't have these things. Sophia Lamb is just straight unlikable from beginning to end. There are attempts by her to make you question motives and outcomes in similar ways that BioShock 1 does, but these attempts almost always fall flat, as she inevitably comes off as bitter and depressing for most of the game. In fact, by the end of the game, I found myself mostly just wishing this person would stop talking to me. Sinclair's character is similarly flat, is a less compelling version of Alice, and in some ways just feels like a vehicle for the developers to fit a guy with an old-timey southern accent into the game. Okay, maybe that's a little harsh, but I really didn't feel anything for this guy, nor did I for the couple other side characters who you will forget about as soon as you leave them. One of the unfortunate things here is that the game actually starts to get kind of interesting in its last act. The last couple sections of the game are by far the most intriguing and actually felt refreshing after an entire game that felt like it was chasing something it wasn't. I think the problem here is that by the time I got to this point in the game, I already felt fatigued and didn't really want to see the game go on for much longer. If the developers had focused on some of these areas sooner, rather than trying to replicate the journey of the original BioShock, I think it would have helped BioShock 2 stand out as its own game. Which leads me to the next point. BioShock 2 is a linear experience that follows the structure of the original almost to a T. You start in one section of Rapture, have to accomplish some goal within that area in order to open the path to take the underwater transportation network to the next section. As you go along this path, you have to stop at each subsequent area and follow basically this same pattern for the majority of the game. Along the way, you'll encounter new areas of Rapture not seen in the first game, but to be honest, they suffer pretty heavily from not feeling new. Most of the levels almost feel like B-sides or leftovers from the original. Now, part of this is undoubtedly due to the kind of novelty that we all experienced in the first BioShock. The developers there created a vivid, memorable world that we just really hadn't seen before in gaming, or maybe anywhere. Each area felt fresh and distinct, despite all of them being connected by the same gloomy, dark, underwater theme. In contrast, the levels in BioShock 2 feel downright uninspired most of the time. It's almost as if they assumed that the source material of the world created in the first game would be good enough to stand on its own no matter how the actual levels were designed, but this is unfortunately not the case. Rapture is a depressing world, right? It's dark, it's dreary, it's bleak, and those types of environments can start to wear on you if there's not enough variety within them to keep things feeling fresh. This is an aspect of design that BioShock 2 unfortunately struggles with, and it ends up affecting the entire game experience. But perhaps the bigger picture error that BioShock 2 suffers from is that it simply does not take enough risks or do enough to differentiate itself from its predecessor. Now, of course, I'm sure there are factors at play here like development time, budget constraints, specific directions from the publisher to not change the game too much. But BioShock 2 is in many ways a sequel that takes the original formula and adds more content without adding more substance. Let me be clear, this is not something that is exclusive to this game. It's something we see all the time in the gaming industry. And it doesn't even mean that we're left with bad sequels all the time. We're just left with sequels that oftentimes feel more like what a DLC pack would be today rather than a fully realized follow-up. Yes, BioShock 2 makes improvements. At its core, it's a more fluid, more robust game. But when you're tasked with making the sequel to what many consider to be an all-time great game, you are very rarely ever going to escape that shadow just by making a few things a little better. Let me give you a prime example that perfectly demonstrates the direction in which BioShock 2 went. In the original game, you play as a normal human character squaring off against Rapture's many tweaked-out inhabitants, including the fearsome Big Daddies, which served as mini-bosses throughout the course of the game. These characters were a weird and beautiful combination that seemed part monster, part mech, and had basically two states on their emotional gear shift, completely sedate or ragingly trying to kill you. They were powerful, had massive amounts of health, and took a lot of planning before taking one on or even deciding if you wanted to take it on. In BioShock 2, your character is a Big Daddy. Like, you get to play as a Big Daddy. How awesome is that? You take control of one of these towering beasts and get to wreak havoc on anyone or anything that gets in your way. Except, you kind of don't. In fact, playing as a Big Daddy in BioShock 2 is exactly no different at all than the character you play in the original. There's a cute visual border around your screen to represent your helmet, and you get to use the Big Daddy drill as one of your weapons. That's it. You move the same, you take the same amount of damage, you still have access to using multiple normal weapons and plasmids, and there are no abilities that are unique to being a Big Daddy. Nothing about the gameplay has been changed to reflect the fact that your character should feel completely different. Even the trademark drill weapon is simply this game's version of a melee weapon and doesn't do anything special except for a charging ability that isn't all that useful anyway. It is absolutely one of the coolest initial concepts that is wasted by not doing anything with it. Imagine if instead we had a game that was centered on this experience of playing as one of gaming's most feared enemies. Imagine if maybe we weren't able to just somehow remove the drill from our hands to use other weapons. Like, how did that become an option? In fact, what if the drill was the only normal weapon we were able to use throughout the entire game, and we were able to add abilities to it rather than adding new weapons? Say, for example, a go-go gadget drill ability that shot out to hit enemies at a distance then shot back to your arm, or expanding on the drill charge found in the game to add new levels of movement, or an ability that, shoots sparks from the drill to serve as a more traditional gun-style weapon. Imagine if the new plasmids in the game were then designed to work around these abilities, like using a plasmid to set a trap at your feet, then grappling an enemy with the grill and pulling them directly into the trap. Think something like the way the game Bulletstorm uses its leash ability. Imagine if the game was actually designed around being a lumbering brute of a character and involved more intentionally slow-paced gameplay that plays into the horror aspect of the BioShock series. Or even implementing environmental puzzles that force you to figure out how to traverse the levels as a hunk of leather and metal. Listen, I know I'm just throwing ideas out here. I know that's the easy part. But my point here is not to demonstrate what the developers should have done. Again, I'm sure there were reasons and a plan to make this game exactly the way it was. My point is more to highlight the potential for what could have been something really cool and could have been something that stood alone as its own game, rather than just the content-focused sequel to BioShock. Now, before concluding, I should state that BioShock 2 is still a really good game. As a shooter, it's better than many of the big-budget games in that genre, and as a horror game, it has a world that is way more vivid and realized than many of the games in that one. It's not really that BioShock 2 is a bad game despite some flaws. It's that it was unrealistic to think there was any way a simple follow-up to one of the most iconic games of all time would have ever been good enough to live up to our expectations. The developers at 2K did a good job creating the game they were supposed to make. It's just not the game that the BioShock world deserved. For that, we would have to wait for the true sequel. But that's another story for another video.
I'm telling the other girls have the